As we get going through the session. Welcome everybody to our ongoing series of virtual coffee chats. Happy to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about valuation to evaluation and looking at that from a different perspective and adding in sort of how do we modernize that. So we've got Mary Beth Kyer, co-founder of Sponsor Circle, to join us and to chat about her experience evaluating thousands of companies and how we can apply that to sponsorship. But just some housekeeping elements for anybody who hasn't used Zoom before. You can mute or unmute yourself using the button on the bottom left of your screen. You can change the view of how you want to see everybody who's on the call. In the top right of your screen, there's a gallery speaker view toggle. And you can also join in on the chat. So if you want to ask any questions, you can just join in on chat and you can ask your questions here, and we're happy to take those as we go. We also want to make sure that this isn't always going to be set up as a presentation from us. We do enjoy talking, but really want to get everybody else involved. So if you want to jump in with questions or feel like you want to take yourself off mute and ask the questions directly to the group, that's fantastic as well. And then in terms of upcoming events, our next session won't be until 2 weeks from now. So we're going to take a break for the holiday week next week. And then we've got 2 sessions lined up the week following. One, we're doing a partnership with Michael Harker and Enigma Research. They've got their next series of survey research coming out on the reopening of attractions. So they've surveyed the groups of the first individuals who've gone back to Disney, to the Fremont experience in Vegas, to Six Flags, looking at what's their experience been, how's that being adopted, what's their comfort level with all of the different pieces that are coming into play in terms of COVID and PPE related to that. And then this is great data for you if you're an organization who's looking to reopen. Just figure out how do I engage with my audience coming through, or if you're working with municipalities or other authorities on, I want to reopen, here's some information that will back how we can reopen. So looking forward to that discussion. That's July 9th. And then July 8th, we've got a conversation with a couple interesting people. We're going to take a step back and give our platform to these 3 individuals. So we've got Janice Smith from ADRA, we've got Megan Ford, who's a communication specialist, and Alina Mashar from Fuse Marketing, talking about systemic racism, looking at the marketing industry, looking at our messaging in terms of sponsorship and that type of engagement, and how we can work to be better. And how we can deal with some of those scenarios. So we've had some great questions over the last few weeks from people about that scenario and everything that's been going on. So happy to bring that to life in July 8th. So without much further ado, love to dive into the topic today and thank everybody for coming on board. So valuation to evaluation, it's really one of those big challenges. It's what am I worth? What am I paying for as a brand? And at the end of it, how do I showcase that we've actually provided that value back? So Mary Beth, you want to hit the next slide? Forbes had a really good piece that came out, and it's just talking about, we know that investment in sports, entertainment, art sponsorship is growing. It's becoming a larger piece of the pie for marketers' budgets. And there's a reason why. It delivers a unique experience. Programmatic advertising, it has purposes, and you get all this ads served up to you, and you can actually figure out the audiences you want, and it will come up on your phone or come up on your computer, and that's being tailored to you. But it doesn't have the same impact that sponsorship does. Sponsorship is pretty unique, and everybody seems to say that. We need to figure out how we value that uniqueness, because you're able to present your messaging as a brand to your audience at a time when they're really open to hearing about it. Enthusiasts love to talk about what they're enthusiastic about. They love to reinforce the brands that are associated with it. NASCAR is a perfect example. If a NASCAR wins, the the sales in the sponsor of that car go up in the 3 to 5 days following that win. And it's amazing to see that impact on audiences. But the challenge associated with that, and Mary Beth, you want to flip to the next slide, is accountability. CMOs, this is also from Forbes, is that CMOs are finding a challenge. What's the vocabulary that they need to have when they go sit in the boardroom and they justify to their board, to their executive team, how they're going to quantify the spend that they've made in sponsorship and the impact it has against all of the other activities that they can be spending money on in terms of advertising. Mary Beth, you want to flip? So 78% of brands report having pressure placed upon them to validate the sponsorship. So that's really becoming a hot button issue for them. And 60% of CMOs are getting direct pressure from CEOs to communicate and measure the sponsorship and impact and performance. So really leading into today's conversation is kind of keeping that in mind, and then how do we bring this forward? How do we, as brands and as properties and agencies servicing both, how do we create that scenario so that CMOs have the resources they need to be able to justify what they've spent and be able to continue to make those investments and be successful in doing so. So that's from my end. I'm going to introduce Mary Beth. Mary Beth is a CPA, CMA. If anybody doesn't know what that is, it's an accountant. So we've got an accountant on our team working with all the numbers, but CMA in particular is about storytelling. It's a management accountant. It's looking at crunching the numbers. So it's great to have that experience on board. And Mary Beth's worked with thousands of companies to look at the value they have, what they have to offer, and create that evaluation. So Mary Beth, I've done a sort of short intro for you, but I'm going to pass it off to you to complete that.
Oh, thank you, Brad. It's really great to be here to talk about evaluation and valuation. And as Brad said, I've really been spending my career looking for that right story that has been told by the numbers. And, you know, a lot of times numbers don't get a lot of attention, especially when it comes to Marcom, because they're a little bit drier. But really, at the end of the day, when it comes to being able to sit and you know, evaluate the success of a campaign or you know, any kind of a project or even a company, you have to be able to look at the numbers, understand the story that's being told there, and then articulate it in a way that makes sense to the folks that that want to hear it. I've spent a good amount of time evaluating thousands of different companies in terms of underwriting the success of their projects. And then on the learning development side, I spent a lot of time evaluating return on investment for large infrastructure projects. And then more recently, working in the Marcom space, really to help organizations to talk a little bit more succinctly about sponsorship initiatives, and in particular, so for budget meetings, so that when you're sitting in a marketing meeting, that you have something compelling and to say as it relates to the sponsorship programs. Now, this isn't a problem for all organizations, but for many, there's a lot of time spent on making that great event experience happen, but then not really having a ton of time or the tools to simplify the process to determine whether or not there was even any success against the goals. And so really that's where I come in. I look to, I've spent the better part on the corporate side of things, spending times in meetings and really trying to say, did we do what we wanted to do? And so when it comes to sponsorship, I want to start at the top, and it's really funny, but sometimes this is lost, especially when you already have an existing sponsorship relationship. Why do brands even buy sponsorship? And if you look at some of the examples here, you can see it's kind of like the customer journey. And where does the brand want to be as it relates to the consumer journey? So, and as an event, you need to understand that so that you can place them and present your opportunity in a way that hits those markers. So to start off, brand awareness. So if the brand isn't known, the beauty of sponsorship is that you can align yourself with an organization that is already established with a target audience, and so the brand can play alongside that event in and be known better than if it was just a simple out of home or billboard or a digital campaign. Sponsorship also is about changing a brand perception. If there is a need or an urgency to be able to change the way that the brand is perceived to the target audience, then it's a really great way. We're certainly seeing that now in COVID, where if you haven't done it, the brands are looking to change the way that they are perceived by their target audience. It's not about the value proposition now. It's really more about how you are supporting your target audience at this time. Another is sampling. If you take a look at just a classic, consumer product, sampling is a big piece for events and festivals. And if you look at more of a B2B space, you're really talking about having the opportunity to demonstrate software, or allowing the leadership team to present and be thought leaders within their industry. There's also others of and most importantly, for those that are really looking further along the consumer path to purchase, is really verifiable leads that can turn into conversion. And that, if the brand is looking for that, then there are great ways, both for real experiences as well as online experiences that can be used to actually get verifiable leads. And lastly, for those brands that are looking to entertain hospitality, it's really working with events, festivals, properties that serve up an experience for not only their clients, but then also the customers that are associated with those clients, as well as other internal employee engagement related activities. So that, in a nutshell, is really some of the key factors. There are other elements, but really, if you put it within the context of where is my brand looking to hit to accentuate where they are in to their target audience, it's really starting off with what do I want to achieve as a brand, and how do I explain that to my my event partner. And so when it comes to that, do you actually have a solution that solves these? And I find sometimes, and especially as there's a lot of circulation of proposals going on these days, a lot of times there really hasn't been a ton of thought associated with what exactly the sponsor is looking to do, and whether or not you have a solution that will solve it better than anything else outside of sponsorship, more traditional means. And it's important to, it's kind of hard to be able to offer that if you don't actually know what they're looking to achieve. And this is really where it comes to the evaluation part. And Brad, you had quite a few examples of the evaluation, and perhaps we can get into that in a few moments. But it starts off with, how can you articulate to the brand what you have to offer if you haven't done the work yourself? So knowing your audience. the beauty of being in today's world is there is lots of data available for brands to be able to either ask of the event to provide it to you or to get it yourself. The joy of folks having little computers, cell phones in their pockets is the fact that there is a trail of information that is left behind, that if you have simply an address or or a range, like a date range, as well as a territory, you can gather up some amazing data about who's at your event and who's been at your event, and then also, of course, online. In addition to doing the valuation process, it's really, know your client, know your assets. So what do you have to offer that will align with the goals of the brand campaign? And then know your competitive alternatives. So in the absence of sponsorship, what's the price point, to do something different? And there are some easy tools that you can find in order to provide you with those comparisons. And then finally, with all of that, how you measure the results. And this is where, of course, the evaluation portion comes into play. So if we start off with just talking a little bit more detail about know your audience, let's talk about some of the traditional tools versus what's available now. So, and I've kind of done the chart based on the amount of results that you can get to kind of tell your story. So traditionally, you had stop and intercept for real events, real world events, and they would ask a series of questions. The nice thing about stop and intercept is that you were able to not only able to glean an understanding of who the target, who that person was, but then also a sentiment about whatever the sponsor was looking to uncover from that target audience. The trouble is, it's expensive. You're really relying on the capabilities of the intern students that has been hired on to do the stop and intercept, and it's pretty costly, and it's really hard to get a robust group of respondents. They're just rushing in and out of an event, and it doesn't really tell you much about any online exposure that event might have gleaned from other channels. Secondly is online surveys. So taking stop and intercept to the next level, it definitely provides a more robust understanding of what the participants of the event, how they felt, and starting to get a broader spectrum of results. And then tourism reports. Tourism reports are often required by grantors, and it serves a very specific purpose. It does provide some compelling information about impact, but it doesn't always have that target audience information, but still really important as to determining how that event or festival plays into the success of the community or the industry that we're talking about. Finally, the data, cell phone data. Things have really changed in a really short time frame, and you can get some really robust information quite easily, and to really tell you a little bit more about the people that have attended your event in the past, and that is either online or in person. And
before you jump in on the cell phone data, just I was at a conference 2 years ago, and it was really focused on the retail space, and it was basically all the CPG managers and the retailers figuring out how they're going to work better together. And a lot of conversation that I haven't heard in the sponsored industry. One, path to purchase was fantastic conversation. It's something we don't talk about enough, I think, in where we fit in on that path. But they had somebody from Google talking about their data and their use of cell phone data. And Google has 7 native apps that they own, and the average person has 3 of those on their phone. So they can track you from the searches that you're doing online, and they know you're looking up Sport Chek online. They can track you right to the moment that you physically walk into the Sport Chek store. They've got all of that trail there. Now, they can't showcase that you actually bought something, but that information is just so valuable. And for us to be able to leverage that for other elements has intense value for us to be able to showcase it. And Mary Beth, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off into that.
No. Please go ahead. I mean, this is designed to be, a coffee chat. So if anyone else wants to share some experiences, that would be really great as well. And I think I remember there was a question that you told me about from someone today that submitted in advance, and it was really about talking about how verifiable that information is. And Brad, did you want to share a little bit about that too?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges people are looking at, making sure that the information they have is verifiable, has some strength behind it. Some of the challenges with the numbers that come from tourism data, some really robust numbers that are amalgamated from a whole series of events, but what's that relative to you and your independent event? So you get a great overview of these are the types of people that come to all of these events, but it doesn't differentiate your event from the one down the road. So you kind of need to figure out how to play that out and explain that to as part of your reporting. And looking at how people answer certain questions. And so Stop and Intercept or online surveys, there's a bias. And sometimes you'll see people will answer the question in the way that they think people want it to be heard. So some of the advantages of some other elements, and cell phone data being a perfect example, is you remove that bias. So the intentional conversation's not there, but you get so much data on who the audience is, where they live, without intruding on them, and it increases your N. And I know Jen from Saskatchewan Science Centre is on board, and you're about to dive into some data that she hasn't seen yet.
So if you start looking at some information and you can glean it over a time frame, it really helps you to understand kind of who these people are and then where they're living, so that you can tie up a really good story, especially for the brands, so that they can speak to, whether or not you really have the target audience. Getting back to, again, what are the goals of the brand? Who are they talking to? If you are only serving up a generic offering, then it's really going to be tough for you to be able to, get some decent sponsorship on an ongoing basis. No company is going to be around for very long if they say that their target audience is generic. And that it's just not going to happen. They know exactly who they're trying to sell to, who they're trying to appeal to based on their goals. And so festivals, properties, virtual experience, they all need to respond to that. Otherwise, you're just offering a vanilla solution that essentially can be deleted the next year if there's no compelling reason that there's actually an attachment to this particular venue or festival.
So we had a question about the cell phone data.
Yeah.
Talk about how we can collect it. So it's being collected by a variety of different sources. So you've got the app proprietors, so Google, etc. They're collecting the data as well. Your carrier's collecting data. Programmatic advertising is collecting the data on an ongoing basis, and they're using it to track their information about who they need to continue to advertise to.
Do you want to explain programmatic advertising?
Sure. So digital advertising, programmatic advertising is, people will call it the annoying advertising you receive. But if you go to the Honda website and then you go to the Globe and Mail website, all of a sudden you start seeing Honda ads on your computer and then on your phone. You've left a digital trail that showed that you had an interest in that company, and now you're being targeted through programmatic advertisers as being receptive to that information. So there's a variety of different ways that you can be segmented, so that the information that I get will be different than what you get in terms of viewing on the same website. And what we're able to do, we've got a partner that we work with who is affiliated on the programmatic advertising side, but they've got a significant history of cell phone data. So everybody has left an anonymized trail of where they've been, and we're able to work with the organizations to be able to say, okay, here's the address, or here's the range of geographic space that we'd like to see who was in the space with their cell phones, and what data can we derive from that. That's how we're able to access it, and Maria's got some information here on the screen.
Yeah. And one of the important things about this is when you do look at this kind of information, it's important to just understand what exactly you're looking at. So for example, if you're looking at, you know, an art gallery, trying to understand kind of who your attendees are, then you want to make sure that you're pulling out you know, those cell phones or that data, the IP address that clearly, you know, is coming back every single day. So it's not really going to be your target audience, it's the employees. So making sure that you're really looking at the information and understanding that this is in fact the target audience. And again, it all ties back to what are the goals of the brand, and making sure that, you know, the brand has been clear on what they're looking for, but then also that the event is able to articulate that, hey, yes, we have this target audience, not based on just what we think. We also are able to provide you with some, you know, some third-party information to supplement, you know, ideas and thoughts about who's attending the events. So there's different levels of information, and really at the end of the day, I mean, you can get super complicated or you can keep it simple. I like simple in the sense that tell a clear story, don't get too crazy in the weeds, but really just like focus in on the things that are most important. But also, if you are working with large dollar sponsorship engagements, that needs to be going a lot more detailed, you know, a lot more information than, let's say, you know, a smaller sponsorship engagement. And I mean, you can use this information to, you know, to speak, obviously, to support, you know, longer term relationships with, you know, with all of your sponsors. It's not something that you would do necessarily for one specific you know, sponsor and then not for another. But again, you know, make sure that you spend the time relative to the sponsorship amounts that you're working with. And so this is you know, this is a fairly straightforward framework that that you can pull. This was done over the course of 2 months, and it was for one location, and it really helped to provide a story of, you know, who's going to this venue, you know, and, you know, what do they look like, what are their interests, and then where do they reside, so that you can all tie it back. And as an event, it's not just satisfying the needs of the brand, it's also understanding where your target audience is, so that next year you're sure to ensure that you're sure to include, you know, these you know, these FSAs, these postal code areas in your target audience, and certainly for you know, brands that are drawing from, events that are drawing from many locations. This is super helpful to make sure that you're focusing in on, you know, the 80% of the folks that are coming, or, you know, the group that the brands are particularly interested in. So moving away from know your audience, again, coming back to that whole brand awareness, change brand perception, sampling, you know, the leads, where you are on that customer journey. you need to know your assets, what you have to sell. So this is kind of like a classic, sales conversation. Do you have a solution that's going to solve a problem? But then also, can you stand back and say, okay, my price point, my contract price is 10,000. Well, how did you come up with that? And this is where you're looking at the numbers, the management accounting component comes in. Like, what is driving that price point? And you need to figure out what that driver is in your assessment. So, a classic, contract is based on hours of effort, for example, in a non-sponsorship framework. And so that you can stand solidly on saying, well, hey, I want a deal. Well, you need to know what you're giving up or what you're negotiating. If you haven't done this work, I know it's not as fun as making your way to the Raptors game and engaging with your clients, but it is necessary. Otherwise, it's really you just leave so much on the table. I cannot express how important that is. And so if you know that your brand is looking at satisfying, certain aspects along this path to purchase, what are you offering, to meet those needs? Product sampling and sales drivers, what would that look like for someone? Branded content, is it advertising, social, and distribution, hosting and hospitality for the existing client engagement. It's really important stuff, and making sure that you've figured out what you have to offer and that it aligns with the goals of the brands.
Yeah, and I think it comes back, Mary Beth, when you're looking at the different elements, and I've been subject to it in the past where I've done it, and I've run the numbers through a template and said, okay, here are how many impressions I'm going to get, and my presenting sponsorship should be X. And the challenge, I think, moving forward is people are becoming much more in tune with how those numbers should be shifting when it comes to other elements of advertising. So what people are paying for an audience in TV will be one thing. How they're going to pay for that in direct mail or in digital advertising is different, and that'll be different based on the brands. So going back to the objective being one of those 5 elements, is it brand awareness through to employee engagement? So figuring out, okay, what's the objective of the brand? Then looking at the different elements of, okay, who's my audience? So perfect example, somebody we've worked with in the past who they really blew their budget on large sports team. They wanted that brand awareness, but their biggest driver was they wanted clients. And the client persona, and I know that's a little bit of a dated term, but their client persona was not the client persona and of the audience coming to those big sports teams. So they just didn't see the end impact of what they needed. So I think as a brand or as a property, we've got to sit and figure out, okay, what's my objective? What's the audience I need? And then out of the list of all the assets, how am I going to deliver on those objectives? So when you're putting together the template that you're now going to start looking at the values on, that's going to change whether you're trying to sell to a bank for your event, or you're trying to sell for a baby stroller company. That those values are going to shift. So it's a little bit more work to figure out that. It's not always going to be this level is $10,000. It's going to be $10,000 has a whole different ranking of benefits. So that tailoring becomes quite important.
Right. And, when you're looking at an assessment like that, in particular, an established, sports property or a big established festival, one of the things a brand would look to is whether they would be able to execute on the promise. So kind of taking it back and looking at it, from the eyes of, a credit assessment of, evaluating the success of a company is, you do a credit assessment. Where has the company been? where are they now, and where are they going? And if you don't have a lot of longevity, what you really lean on is, do they have the management team to actually execute on whatever their mandate is as an organization? And then do they have the money to make it happen? And so a lot of times you'll see that misalignment of, of looking for a target audience in a really established property, because you don't want to, again, coming back, you want to have some sort of return on the investment you've made, and you want to actually have an event go on. Like, you don't want to, tie yourself to an organization that ultimately doesn't deliver. And of course, Classic Fire Festival is one of them. It's just like, you get sold something, and and it just doesn't happen. And so that is why sometimes there is a misalignment. But if you do that valuation component, if you really spend some time, working with a brand, even if you are a brand new event, you've never done anything, it's the management team that you would lean on, and their current access to cash. In the past, there's been I've had questions related to what happens if a brand puts in their sponsorable investment, but then they know that to be successful they have to have another 2 or 3 equivalent sponsors going in at the same time, and so it's really important to understand what that how that event is operating, who they're working with as a brand now, and what will they do, or what do they have as a reserve to to respond in the event that they don't get the second or third sponsorship opportunity. And then of course, how have you protected your funds to ensure that you've actually going to get what you're serving up as a sponsorship amount, and whether or not it'll actually come to fruition.
And I think if you've got, you're an organization that has longevity. So thinking about where Anheuser-Busch has shifted their sponsorship activities is they've actually started to look at the activity of the team on the field. So they're looking at it from a perspective of, the value for the first 2/3 of the year might be X, but if you decide at the end of the season that you're going to tank your team in order to get the first round draft pick, they've actually got it worked into their process that the value of your sponsorship comes down. So there's some interesting things coming into play. So your assets may actually change over the time of the year.
Yeah. And we're seeing these kinds of things, clauses in contracts for larger sponsorship amounts, but it's coming. Like, I think sponsorship has been a little bit behind the times in terms of providing suitable metrics and measurements to justify a spend in many instances, hence the reason why there's this frustration on the part of the CEOs, CFOs, and CMOs of organizations. And it's coming. So a performance-based makes total sense, especially because that if they make the playoffs, there's more exposure, more experience, better like more equity, like more passion that goes into being aligned with an organization that that's made it further on in the playoffs. Like, that's just gold for a brand, but they're gonna have to pay for it, and they won't pay for it if they don't make it. And you're seeing a lot more clauses in sponsorship contracts, especially in light of COVID, with everything kind of being shut down and not getting that kind of exposure that you were expecting. A lot of very established brands were kind of caught without any kind of clauses. The importance being that you're supporting the events and festivals and properties, even in times of difficulty, but it's still important to make sure that you understand. And so there is that, and then also just understanding what the value of of what you have to offer is. And if we move a little bit into kind of the third part, and that is really know your competitive alternatives. So if the whole concept of sponsorship didn't even exist, what are your options as a brand to do something similar to that sponsorship does? Now, again, as we said, sponsorship creates memories aligned with your brand that really it's hard to to get the equivalent. However, there are alternatives, and so you as a salesperson on the event side need to understand, what is my competition? What are other festivals and conferences charging? If I'm looking for, for more or less, what exactly am I offering? And then also, in the absence of sampling for a traditional property, there are other programs and organizations out there that provide sampling opportunities to brands that are direct. So understanding what the cost associated with that is. Sampler, I've put up here, is an organization that that is a Canadian success story. They typically work in the beauty sector, but they do direct to consumer experiences, and it's pretty compelling opportunity. Broadcast, have you looked at the break cards? Like what is the pricing available just in a simple advertising? And then also there are evaluation templates out there. And Brad, did you want to speak a little bit about that in terms of, I believe it was IEG that you've used in the past?
Yeah, so there's a couple different templates that exist out there. IEG's had one that's been established for 20 odd years. And it will run you through all the basics. It will look at, how many people are walking by your signs? How many signs do you have? You have a mention from your person who's on stage in terms of your MC or other things, right through to the percentage of advertising space that you've got in the local paper. So you can generate numbers from there. The challenge I found with a lot of those templates is they give you a range. And I know that Victoria's got a question here. What's the cost per viewer or attendee? And that, from the IEG valuations, that could range from a half-cent through to $10, depending on the different types of items, assets that you're looking at. So how do you judge where you are as part of that? Are you the half cent or are you the $10 value? And it's looking at some of these other elements, whether it's sampler, whether it's going on to Google AdWords or going on to LinkedIn or Facebook, and putting in your audience and looking at what's going to cost to buy 1,000 people in that audience. And that's going to give you a pretty good value to know that, is it $10 per 1,000? Is it $100 per 1,000? And that's going to give you a good estimate of where you're at. And then the caveat on all of it is, as much as you can go through and you can say, okay, I valued my presenting opportunity at 500,000. It's what else is in the market. So there's a bit of a what will the buyer actually purchase at, and your competition is going to kind of help set that up. But you've got that verifiable information that you've thought through and be able to showcase it. And yeah, so then you've just said there, Victoria, just about it's verified number of engagements similar to ad placement, and that's really some of your benchmarks, because that's going to be your competition. If they're going to spend $50,000 with you, why is that more valuable than buying a full page ad in the paper? So you've got to prove that, so that the person who's actually purchasing off you can justify it in the boardroom when they're asked the question.
Mm-hmm. I think also, if you just stick to the numbers, it's one thing, but really it's has a lot to do with the quality of the engagement as well. And when you kind of get into, quality measurement, it's a little bit more difficult, but, and people will have differing opinions as to whether it's, it's accurate, but how many touch points along the way of the customers, a path to purchase, are you giving? And is there an opportunity before, during, and after? And as the consumer becomes more aware of who you are, and I say consumer, but I also mean, a B2B experience as well. So, the customer is more familiar with your brand, what can they do now? And are they ready? Are they listening at the moment that you're serving up a promotion, a coupon, a conversation? And so it's really looking at, are you helping the brand to tell the story in different ways for them to get from brand awareness all the way to a path to purchase? And how have you systematically mapped that out for the brand? And it's not just the event or festival that needs to do that, it's the brand as well. And sometimes, if the relationship has been around for a while, sometimes it's not necessary. But when times are tough, it's it's one of those things that you wish you had done in the past, to justify the future spend. And so with everything happening now, where budgets are moving, our client brands are making different decisions, looking at other opportunities. You need to be able to justify what you have to offer. Not only the quantifiable components, but then also the quality aspects. What's going to be that thing that that thing that comes with sponsorship, the memory, that memorable experience that the brand gets to align themselves with.
And I think part of that discussion, Mary Beth, is everybody gets fixated on, I need the biggest numbers.
Yeah.
I need to be able to say that I had X million people come to my event or come through my event, and it's the value of the audience, the value of the individual. And I think about there's a large attraction in Montreal that happens to be situated next to where they put the Cirque tent every year. So they get an incredible amount of traffic that happens to be walking on the sidewalk in front of where they are, going to Cirque du Soleil, but they count those all in their number. And is that real value to the sponsors of that attraction? And that becomes really questionable. So you look at who's there, and I've seen other events that have done really well where the audience was one. You had a whole event, but there was one particular client, one particular person that the sponsor needed to engage with for a business reason or for some other reason, and that became their motivation for sponsoring. So it is finding that, what's the objective of the sponsor, what do they need? And I guess a third example of it, anybody who's been through Ottawa Airport, when you go through the line at security, there is a large poster billboard advertisement there in the line. And it is incredibly amazing how niche that advertisement can be. I've seen it be for military hardware. I've seen it be for very specific business equipment. And I think they're really looking to speak to one or two specific people who are going through that line on a regular basis, just to catch them while they're at a moment where they might be able to take it in. So yeah, your value is going to change, and the more you know what your audience, the better standing you're going to have for proving that value.
Right. And so it takes us to the evaluation component now, and that is, we've done our work. We've determined what we have to offer to support the brand requirements, and you're able to execute on it. But then how do you measure it? And part of the upfront valuation is really determining what of those assets are you going to put in, engage to make that happen. And thinking, strategically about what those goals are, making them specific, measurable, verifiable, ideally with third-party, assessments. Can you achieve them? Are they relevant, time-oriented? I mean, there's so many, but again, knowing where your brand is, you know, where we want to be, and, you know, making sure that that you're hitting those, then it's you know, you have a better chance to put together some general measurements. And, you know, we start getting into the really kind of, you know, numbery stuff. And, you know, this is where the joys of kind of, you know, being, you know, living in recent time. In the past, there weren't really a lot of tools out there that did like in-depth, you know, reporting that didn't have a large price point. There's some really, really great tools out there, you know, that for tier 1 brands, you know, it's important, you know, the investment in sponsorship warrants the amount of the pricing. But there are now other solutions out there that will really help to, you know, simply create that story that you're looking for, that you can speak to, you know, in your marketing, you know, budgeting meeting. And some of the things that the tools will do, it'll help you understand, you know, cost per reach, you know, touch points along the path to purchase, if that's something that's of importance, you know, brand lift in social and media, you know, setting up different kinds of campaigns, you know, sales leads, like, you know, and what I love about virtual events is that, you know, you're not just talking about impressions, you're talking about people's emails, you know, ensuring that the events are actually requiring, you know, email registrations, and that there's opt-ins, you know, if people want to know more. And of course, you know, sampling, and then, you know, survey of sentiment. So, you know, if sampling is really important, then, you know, how are you going to deliver that to your client in a virtual way? We had, you know, great conversation a couple of weeks ago, and you know, talking about hybrid conferences where you're actually delivering essentially a swag bag that you're not supposed to open until the conference, and that you can actually kind of have an experience at the same time, being virtual. And those are really great things to think about that have, you know, that that resonate with, you know, with B2C as well as B2B customers, that, you know, that are help to establish that quality of engagement. Yeah.
And we've got a statement from Victoria about putting a couple slides about valuation into decks, and I think that's really important. That, you know, one, you've given some thought to how it is you're justifying to your prospective sponsor, this is why I think it's of this value. And additionally, you know, as part of that, the evaluation piece can't happen post event. You've got to have an understanding ahead of the event what the objectives are. So it really sits, you know, and sets up the expectations for what you're going to deliver on the back end, as well as establishes your workflow. That, you know, I need to capture these 6 items in order to prove success. I think about one sponsor we're working with, and every piece of data that she gets fed goes into this elaborate Excel spreadsheet that I've seen, and she ranks every single customer that comes through there in order to put them on her lead list. So when she gets an opt-in, it doesn't mean she's going to call them the next day. She actually ends up adding all the score, and once they hit a threshold, then it goes into part of her her sales leads. So there's things like that, and you just have to have an understanding of where your sponsor's coming from.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of share a little bit, Victoria is a cinematographer, and they are just in the midst of finalizing a short animation. And you know, if you look at some of the things that are of great value for you know, for them, it's they already have established themselves. They already are Emmy winners. They're, you know, being submitted for the Oscars. They have, you know, great distribution already signed. So those are, you know, those are the things that create value that, you know, you need to quantify before you just come up with some, you know, random number. So yeah.
And I guess a couple of the advanced questions, Marybeth, I'll throw this for you to answer.
Yeah.
Is how does this change relative to COVID, or does it?
The importance of valuation and evaluation is still there. I think what makes it more important is that last year's budget is not guaranteed. And so therefore, if you are, running a large budget, if you're a B2B company that is, that does a lot of industry events virtually, and are looking to, build out that that leads and converting to sales, what's that budget look like? And you need to make sure that you're working with events that truly know who comes to their events, online or in person. And so the risk of losing is greater now in times of COVID. So what you do really hasn't changed, or shouldn't have changed. I think just the importance of it is now ever present, because last year's numbers, you're not going to flip them over and just, be done with it. And, there's a lot of sponsor opportunities have been taken off the table, and consumers are looking for a different conversation with the brands that are supporting them in the community. So, there's opportunities, but then you need to be able to quantify and qualify them for sure.
Yeah, and I think Victoria's addition to it is that as much as she's building the valuation herself, CMOs still feel conservative. So having a third-party valuation, if you can afford it, there's a number of organizations you can do it, or you can use a template and refer back to that. I think that element of the fact that you've had some thoughtfulness, whether you've paid an outside person to do it or you're using a sort of an outside resource, creates that thoughtfulness. And that you've actually thought about your price. You haven't just said, I need $50,000 and I'm going to ask for it, without thinking about what makes that up.
Yeah, for sure. And let's be clear. Everyone wants a deal. It doesn't matter. Everyone wants a deal. So, if you're looking for, to give up, brands are going to look to understand, like they want a discount on that return on investment. So you need to know what exactly you're giving up, and whether it's still going to work for you. And, again, it comes back to really understanding what you're offering up and whether the brand sees that as value. Because some things you think aren't important, if you actually have a conversation, you might be surprised at what comes up to the top of the list. And finally, like some trends again, in light of COVID, we're starting to see contracts written with new clauses in it. We have a sponsor client that, is, putting in, holdbacks, of a percentage that they don't get the funds until they deliver on the measurement reports. Now, for large sponsors, it does pose problems with procurement to be able to do that. And so, there you can put the funds in escrow. It's something that we're working on, to really facilitate the transaction, so you're not having to go back to procurement twice to cut two checks. But then deadlines, like there's a lot of changes that we're seeing. Of course, a lot of brands did not have force majeure in their contracts, and so they expected a traditional number of passers-by of their advertising, especially as you said at the airports, certain types of eyes going, but when nobody's walking by that, suddenly the perceived value is nothing. and so you're going to start seeing a lot of different clauses in the contracts, even with existing clients, just so that there is that performance component, whether it's the property's fault or not. You know, at the end of the day, it is a results-driven conversation, and you know, and we can't be surprised, like it's been happening on, you know, in the rest of the advertising industry, that there is a lot of reporting and results and measurement that you can get. So, you know, it's to be expected that, you know, that it's coming in sponsorship in a more broader fashion than just the really large sports properties that do a really great job of providing metrics back. I'm sorry, but I see, are there a couple, I see a couple of questions.
No, we've captured all the questions.
Oh, okay.
We're good. Sorry, I thought you were advancing your slide.
Oh, I don't think, no, I'm done.
Okay, great. So we're just a little bit over, so thank you everybody for sticking it out. You know, lots of questions, and you know, sponsorship sometimes gets called unique, or a lot of times gets called unique. I know from talking with a lot of brand managers, marketing managers, that it gets treated as a bit of a black magic activity. So the more we can validate who we've got, how we're getting there, and be able to showcase it on the back end, is going to help marketers, CMOs, the decision makers prove the value they're investing, as well as bring us up all as an industry that, you know, organizationally, we know what we have to offer and what our competitive advantage is. So that's kind of my summary 2 cents. Mary Beth, do you have anything you want to add?
No, it's a good topic to have, especially as we start gearing up, and you know, being prepared to understand that what your virtual offering is, if you've moved your event onto online, versus your physical, and making sure that you can really articulate the difference and knowing what the brands are looking for in your event.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for coming. We're going to take a break next week, July 8th.